Hello, and welcome to this Easily Tracking Changes in Your Applications with InterBase Change Views webinar. As many of you know, my name is Mary Kelly. I'm a software consultant and InterBase enthusiast here at Embarcadero. If you have any comments or questions regarding InterBase or RAD Studio, feel free to reach out at mary.kelly@embarcadero.com and I would be happy to answer any questions. On our agenda today, we'll go over what Change Views is and the requirements before jumping into how to implement Change Views in our servers and also in our applications. We will have a live Q&A, so drop any questions you may have in the questions panel of GoToWebinar. To understand the present, we need to know more about the past. Traditional ways of tracking changes were typically done by following either triggers or date field or timestamps and creating a new table or multiple tables. You would place a trigger on a table and the changes to that table would get logged in a log table that stated that these changes had occurred. That log table would be there for every single user or subscriber who needed data tracking. Then you would connect to the database, you would work your way through that change log, and you could find that it would be an extremely difficult thing to query, or that it could take a very long time for you to query something specific on a certain table. Now, of course, this wasn't all bad. It did have its purposes, being used for audit trails or logging, database integrity and such, but in the search for a modern solution, this isn't always a sustainable idea for many organizations, especially as they aren't a great tool for mobile, and in terms of cost effectiveness, might not be the most robust solution for cloud usage as well. With date and time field stamps, they can create an enormous record for your database tables, as they go through and add extra fields or columns for each time or date stamp to track those changes. If you're tracking changes at the record level, then each field has the additional date field, which causes an increase in your disk usage, making it more difficult to maintain and understand the data that you do have. And beyond that, in a lot of cases, you have to have them planned from the beginning. And this can be a difficult process to add them in later on, as you have to make sure that the queries all work, especially when tied to your customer application. Plus, those extra fields can carry either redundant or even sometimes wrong data, and that can also make managing your databases a pain. So InterBase's solution is Change Views. Change Views are a subscription-based model that are used to subscribe to some data and identify what data has been changed in the database. So you can create a subscription that covers different tables and columns and allow or give access to your users the rights to subscribe to the changes in the data. Now, from the security perspective, there's no log tables or anything, so it's a very clean setup that tracks internally, so you don't have to worry about those external files that everyone has access to, or something that someone could scan to find out information relating to changes or updates of your database. So only the people who are subscribed to those data changes can actually see the changes made available to or for them. Now, these subscriptions can be run both during a connection and spanning a connection. So during a connection, you can get an alert and just fetch those deltas. So if you were to fetch a few thousand records and then get a message that says there have been changes to the table, you can use Change Views to get the delta instead of having to refresh the whole query over again, which reduces the time and data movement over your network. Now, for spanning a connection, one of the really cool things is that you don't actually have to be connected to the database for it to record the changes. Once you start a database transaction, you can have a subscription set, then disconnect from your database, and then start a new connection with a new transaction at a future point in time. So for mobile devices, this is huge, as we don't always have our smartphones connected to the internet. Now, in today's world, we try to stay as connected as possible in some form or fashion, but maybe you're out of Wi-Fi range and maybe your carrier's charging more. and sometimes you just don't really want to think about downloading a few thousand or even a few million records over your mobile phone plan and thinking, how much is this one going to cost me? Change views can help to reduce the number of packets sent from point to point, reducing time and saving you resources. And each subscriber can have multiple devices, so you can run a single user connected to the database, and then everyone has this unique identifier for their subscribers, or each subscriber could have an ID for their phone, laptop, tablet, and desktops. So what's really all that different about change views and how it tracks data? It's near zero effect on database speed, since there's no logging for tables and triggers and these special database users or time field stamps. Change views is exceptionally lightweight and fast and built into the InterBase core to work on both the server and deeply embedded versions of InterBase. You get field level granularity. You just basically create a script and run it to subscribe to your data. As you're subscribing to the data and granting specific users access to see it, it's almost like a news feed for your Twitter account. You don't have to worry about table metadata changes, automatically filters your changes, and because it's built into InterBase, it actually uses SQL to find changes. So since you're using plain old SQL to perform these operations, you can run select statements that ask what or how many records have changed. You have integration with FireDAC and IBX components. It's highly scalable and it minimizes your on-disk size. Now, as to the benefits of using change views, when you make any changes, you have to fetch or get that data whenever you apply the updates. Now, as time goes on, you make changes, and when you make more and more changes, you have to fetch those new changes every time. Using InterBase change views, though, you can now identify specifically what deltas have been changed to the field level. So using that, you only need to package and move the data that has been changed. So you reduce costs and disk I/O by minimizing your data syncs on mobile devices. It has a little impact on performance. You have those no external log tables. It's highly scalable for all of your users, and you can track changes the way you want, easily. Now, when change views sync, only the changes between the local and server databases move, which keeps your data accurate and current. When it comes to talking about how change views actually works, we have a subscription. And this subscription allows us to subscribe to specific columns or all the columns that may span a single or multiple tables. You can create this subscription to insert, delete, or update any changes. And once created, then you have either one subscriber or multiple subscribers that can be added to this subscription so that it collects their data based on those requirements for the subscription. So people or devices can subscribe to whatever changes you have available to them. So like mailing lists or Google Alerts. You can choose what content you want to receive alerts or information on and say, I want the email as it appears, so hourly, daily, weekly, and just like Google Alerts, you can have multiple subscriptions that you can subscribe to. Each user can have multiple devices, of course, subscribed, or you can see a certain number of devices and define those devices with a tracking ID, such as a GUID or some other device identifier. Now, one fascinating feature of change views that I really like is that when you connect to your central database and you're posting your local changes, the next time you ask for those updates, you won't have the same changes sent back to you in the session. Now, this is really cool because unlike a transaction, we can span across the connection, right? And you can sort of pick up right where you left off and then ask what the changes are. And because you don't have those additional logs, there's that little impact on the database performance when you have a lot of devices connected. Now that we have an understanding of what change views are and how they work, let's go through how to set up your servers and the steps you can take to add change views functionality to your applications. Now, I'm currently logged into IB Console, and I have the medicines database as well as the pharmacy database that we're going to go through today. And in the medicines database, I have 3 tables here. Now, to create subscriptions, you're going to need to have subscriptions added to the database. Now, the way that you go about this is by doing a backup and restore to a newer version of InterBase. InterBase change views began with XE7, so you're going to need to have an on-disk structure that matches with XE7, 2017, or 2020. Within these tables, I just have some categories, medications, as well as the linking of the category to the medication ID. If we take a look at these tables, we can see here there's nothing special really about them. They are using domains, but specific to any triggers or any stored procedures, there is nothing on any of these tables. It's just creating a table and setting a primary key. Now, when we go into those subscriptions, we already have one created. So if we take a look at that subscription, we will be able to see the metadata for it. You can create subscriptions via IB Console or iSQL. If you're using iSQL, you'll just take this SQL statement and utilize that in iSQL. Now, we use create subscription, then we take the name of the subscription that we're wanting to create, as well as deciding what tables it is that you want to track. Now, in the case of this database, I'm wanting to track the inserts, updates, and deletes to all 3 tables in my database. I also have a description that was added to it, which you can choose to use or not. Now, if we go through and create this with IB Console, you can just right-click and create. Then you can choose the name of your subscription. I personally use sub_ for everything, and we'll title this medicine. Click on add, and the wizard that you get here lets you determine the tables as well as the fields specifically that you want to track. If you don't need to track any of the fields, then I highly recommend just choosing this table and clicking OK. This will update you to any changes. If you would, though, like to track the specific fields within a table, say maybe the patient advice and special warnings in the event that they change, any changes to that, or you can also choose to look at the inserts, updates, and deletes to these fields within this table. We'll change this to advice. You can click OK, and it creates that subscription for you. We can double click, and now you can see that we've created a subscription called Sub Medicine Advice on the table medicine with parentheses around the fields that we're specifically tracking for inserts, updates, and deletes. Now we have a very similar situation in our pharmacy database. Our pharmacy database does have those same 3 tables as we have in our medicines database, as well as the customer, orders, and the pharmacy as well. So if you're looking at, again, the structure behind these tables, they're very similar. We take a look at some of the metadata for our pharmacy customers. We can see here there's nothing too special about it other than the encryption that I've added to this database for protection. So it's just creating the database table with our fields, the primary key, and then altering it to include the foreign key. Now, if we go into our subscriptions here as well, we have 3 subscriptions that we've created. We've got a pharmacy updates, pharmacy deletes, as well as a name change. So if I click on this one again, we can see here that we're creating a subscription on orders, customers, and the pharmacy tables for inserts and updates. At this point, we do not care about those deletes. In the event of deletes, we've created a specific separate subscription for those orders and customers when they delete a order. Now, at this point, all we're going to have to do is choose to subscribe to that change view. So once the change views have been subscribed to, that's when we'll start to see the changes that are occurring. Now, we won't subscribe to it directly from IB Console. We'll subscribe to that from our application, as I'll show you next. From here, we're going to take a look at our application to sort of get an understanding of what's happening before we take a look at the code in the background. Run this application, and then also pull it up as well here so that we have two, where we can go and make some changes within my simple editor. Now this simple editor is just a slightly easier way for us to visualize and get some information into our database so that as we go through and make those changes, it'll just be a little bit easier for us to see. Now within this, I've got a set of categories here that I've created along with medications, and within each of these medications, they're all just labeled with that medicine ID matching the category that I'm choosing here. Now in this situation, let's say we want to make some changes to the allergies category. So maybe I just want to change that to be allergy. We can save that. And I want to say that this medication, we'll just add a random value here. Let's just respell that. Commit that. We can refresh it if we'd like to. And if we were to go into our database here, I will just alter this to match my database. We can go through and we can fetch those deltas. Now, as we see, we did make changes to our database. We went, instead of using allergies, we changed that to allergy, and within the medications, we also made changes there. So we updated the data for one of our allergy medications and just added on that additional value, and of course, the categories match there. So if there were any changes, they would be posted there as well. When you go through and insert new data as well, if we go through and say, okay, let's add in a value 16 and we'll call that augmentin, and we'll just go through and copy that in and say okay to this, add augmentin to the list. And now if we go through and go back and fetch those deltas, we'll be able to see that we added in something to the database. Now these changes, since we did subscribe to them, they are now being pulled from our main medicines database server to our P1 client. We can post those, and those categories will now be listed, and we can now see that we have augmentin added to that list. And we could even do the same thing then by changing this to P2, go through and fetch any deltas that there may have been that have changed since we've opened and connected to this database. We can go back to our simple editor and change this back to allergies, or perhaps make a change to cardiovascular medication, save that, and go through and pull any of those categories. You can use a showed merged, where when you pull those, it'll actually show you what specifically has been altered. Now, if we go into the rest of the fields here, even within our description, the description never changed, so it is not bolded. Only the update to the cardiovascular medication category ID name is going to be altered. And basically, by posting our deltas, we're now then able to update our local copies of the database with the most recent up-to-date data that's been taken from the server. Now, if we take a look at the code in the background behind this, we can see here that we've got our FD connection, we've got a connection to the remote database as well. Now this FD connection is going to be our local copy as well as our remote copy. We have the IB driver and wait cursor as per listed for FireDAC, and then we have just a few queries. We've got the query for the server, so selecting everything from pharmacy for the query there. We've got a category, so select everything from the category name and then order it by the category. All of these are pretty simple queries where we're just pulling that data from our local database. So this is just going to be all of the local database connections that you'll be using. Then within our delta, we're going to create a fresh connection to that data. So within this query, it's just going to be running the exact same. So we're just going to be running the same queries for category medicine and medicine categories that we would to our local data. If we take a look at, for instance, the query the medicines, you can see that it's a pretty complex SQL statement where you do have joins compared to what we're going to see with DM Delta, where it's a very simplistic select everything from medicine rather than as complex as we were looking for before. Now this is going to make the process a lot easier to use something as simple as select everything would be, only because when you're merging data and it's really complex, the more complex your SQL statements, the more likely you are to have difficulties with understanding where problems are happening. So being as simplistic as possible is one great benefit to change views. You'll notice that we have this transaction delta here, and this transaction is connecting to our remote server. Now if we take a look at the properties for this, you'll see that we're set to the isolation as snapshot, and we're also going to use rollback. And once we have this transaction set up, then we can go and activate our query for the subscription. So this is just setting the subscription sub-medicine updates at P1 active. Now, what you'll notice here is that these are actually going to be the same queries. We're just going to run the same queries on each of these as the remote to the local. And then we have a mem table here. So we're just going to use these mem tables to physically do the merging. Now, if we take a look at the code underneath, when we created the data module, we passed both the local and the remote database details. We've set the transaction as well as the subscription to the remote database connection. So once those are connected, then we can start the transaction to the remote database as well as setting that subscription to be active. So any of the changes that happened when we were disconnected, we can then pull those changes and be able to see what exactly is happening. We then set up the query so that both the category and the category delta, in this case, or both of these queries, would run the exact same SQL statements, both locally and remotely. Then we call this open all procedure, which basically sets these queries to cached updates being true. Then we can open those queries, which then lets us merge all of the data. We then are setting the subscription as well as then querying and reopening those deltas, opening those deltas. Now the subscription as well as the deltas are going to run only within the transaction. Now we did have the option for that show merged. If we take a look at that in our customer updates, you can choose the showed merge to pull all of those deltas. And the feature behind this is built into FireDAC actually. So it's just going to be this merge data set. So when you're writing out your FireDAC queries, you'll take that and just use the merge data set. The query that you're wanting to use, which then lets us merge a data set that we're using into the mem table. And in this case, we're just updating that data set. Then from there, we're going to apply the delta merge, which will just be all of the deltas that we pulled from our remote table. So once that we've gotten to that point, it then just applies all of the updates and changes into our table and commits the transaction delta. And that's really the simplest way that we can explain how to use change views and really implement it into your existing applications. Now we'll take a look at a few other examples as well. Now, of course, you've seen this application before. What we're going to do is slightly go over how we've also set up this application so we have a connection to the original data, if you will, and then we'll also have a connection to those changes. We've got a query as well as an event alerter, which basically says that when there's data that's been changed in the original query, we then use this event alerter to state that there is a change, and it will then refresh the connection that we have. Now, both of these queries have the exact same connection, and it's just a select everything from tab, and we can see that there. When we post data to the original query into the database, it then sends an alert back to this EA changes EA changes then pulls the alert, says, hey, there's a change, then requeries and has those changes. Then the last application that I want to show you is with the data merge project. Now, what's really cool about this data merge project, once I go ahead and open up the form here, is that we are going to take a central InterBase database as well as a SQL Server database, and we're actually going to merge those. So as you can read on the form, this application was used as a sample to take a MS SQL database and sync that into a InterBase database where then we could utilize change views to provide those deltas to the remote database. So this, again, allows for a reduction in network traffic and also speeds up the time that it takes to actually update and insert records into a remote database. And if we go through and run this application, I already have it configured. So what I'll do is I'll show you the data in SQL Server first. So I went ahead and created this medicines database and also set up a few categories, the same 3 tables that I did: category, medicine, and medicine categories. And within this application, what I can do is once I've have the location of my medicines database and then also where my SQL Server instance is running, I can select merge, and it'll log me into my credentials for InterBase. It'll also log me in to my credentials for SQL Server, and I can click OK. I'm connected to both servers, and it's now processed the updates to SQL Server, processed the updates as well to InterBase, and if I minimize that, I can rerun this query, and you can see that the data that I had actually updated into my database for InterBase has now also been posted into my SQL Server database. Now, one great benefit to doing this is that if you are looking for a solution or you're looking for an option where you already have SQL Server in some instances, or you already have InterBase and you're needing to be able to work between both of them, you're then able to sync the data between both databases, which can also help in terms of migrating data to a different database or even just expanding out your current operations. If we go back through the code behind this, because it's actually pretty simple here, but all we've done is we've taken the connection. All we've done is we've created a connection to our database. We're creating the connection to InterBase. We're creating the connection to SQL Server. Take a look at that code. And we're starting a transaction and opening up those queries. Now within this main controller, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we're creating the connection to these databases here, and we're adding in a few properties as well. So the text behind the InterBase, whatever the location of our InterBase database is, this edit form, as well as the location for our SQL Server database, along with the login for those details. We're setting the transaction to read committed and then opening up both connections. Now, we added a message just to say that we're connected to both servers. In the event you're not, you'll then be prompted to re-log in using the proper protocols, and then we can actually pass along the updates to MS SQL. So again, we're just using the queries for each of these and what the categories are, and we're actually just migrating or moving the data from each of these categories that are being held into our SQL Server database. Then we also go ahead and sync back up to process any updates to the InterBase database as well, free both of those, and then from there we now have synced the data between a SQL Server database as well as an InterBase database. For resources available, I've included the links to both the InterBase and RadStudio DocWiki sites, and this is going to be the main hub of information for both InterBase and Delphi or C++ Builder. You'll find code and application samples, components documentation, and a lot more relating specifically to InterBase, FireDAC, and IBX. There are 2 specific links that I want to highlight for change views and FireDAC change notifications. Both detail additional information around InterBase's change views, such as how to set up the change views as we've shown here today, and the capabilities of the change views applications that are shipped with RAD Studio. Those sample applications in general, using InterBase along with the pharmacy and general change views applications. And for download and video links, I have the trial downloads for all of the products used in this webinar today. There are also several videos that work with change views and additional InterBase features on our YouTube channel. Thank you again for attending this webinar on tracking changes with InterBase change views. Now let's get to the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you do have any questions after this session, please feel free to reach out to me at mary.kelly@embarcadero.com. Thanks again.
Fantastic, Mary. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Of course, it's always so much fun to do these webinars.
Yeah, it's the same way for me. I enjoy doing webinars and presenting and stuff like that. The process of learning diving into the content and filling in the gaps in my knowledge and then presenting it in a way that I think is interesting is I've always found enjoyable.
Yeah, definitely agree with you there.
So if anybody needs the slides, a copy of the slides, they are available in the handout section there and GoToWebinar. You can download those. Occasionally there is some odd behavior with Chrome in downloading them. So if you do have any trouble downloading them, try Firefox to download them.
Hello.
Oops, accidentally muted you. Sorry. So Eric has a few questions here about change views, simply tracking, who's changed table since such and such. So I don't know if you want to elaborate some more on that. I see you answered some of the questions in the chat window here as well already.
Yeah, so specifically, change views was really designed more so to look at what data's changed rather than who specifically is changing that data. Now, since within your application, remember, you have to subscribe to change views. So if you're subscribing to those, you could always use something like auditing for that, if you really need to know exactly who the users are that are changing the data itself.
How does auditing work then within InterBase?
So auditing is exactly like how you would expect it to work within most databases. You can either set it up so it's got either like external, like an additional table, for instance, that specifically tracks, when a user makes any change, log it in this table, which you can always kind of export out to logs if you need to as well. So it's not, like I said, it's not exactly any different than what you would expect with any other database out there. But that's one way that you could go about designing your kind of process or your system for having that auditing in place so that you can track those specific users rather than just the data.
Okay, so yeah, change views are more about just seeing what's changed. But I suppose if you had like I know I've seen some tables that have like a last changed column and then who changed the column in the table. So if you had something like that, the change views would show you would it show you the history? So like, let's say you have that last changed by and last changed date column in a table, and you're subscribed to that table, and somebody changes it, and then somebody else changes it, and then somebody else changes it, and then you reconnect to get the update. Do you see all three of those changes or just the last change?
So you would see all three of those changes, specifically since it's two separate columns, you would see the fact that those changes had occurred. Now, the data that you would see, of course, would be the data that is most recently updated, but you would at least be able to see the history of who's had access to those columns, just because they are, essentially, it'll track it by the field, right? So anytime that a field is changed or field is inserted, it will track those specific changes. So if those are the two fields that are changing, then it'll track those. It won't necessarily give you, like I said, that full audit history of, XY of, user X changed this, user Y changed it to this, and user Z changed it to this. It'll just be, like I said, those three users will be tracked. and then it'll just state that they changed that data. So you'll be able to kind of, like I said, utilize more so an auditing system rather than just using change views to look at everything relating to what exactly is there.
Hmm. Cool. All right. That's actually sounds really useful.
Yeah, yeah,
I guess that's the point.
yeah, and I will say I think really when you're looking at kind of tracking users and tracking data specifically, um, I have found that most times there are systems that are, or typically if you have to track your users, there are specific requirements that are needed for for tracking those specific changes, and there's software out there that's been created that meets within compliance rules and regulations. That's literally what the entire job of it is, right? Is to monitor all of those. And I think when
Right.
it comes to being able to say, I think it's not even necessarily that would be too difficult to do. I think it's just more so to ensure, compliance. We don't want to step on, hey, we can't say we're compliant in this, but we can do this or that. So I think from that standpoint, also it just helps it helps to say we provide you the tools with being able to become compliant in your organization's vertical.
Excellent. All right. Great. Well, thank you so much, Mary, for this presentation. I always learn a lot. InterBase is so a little story. One of the first databases I worked with was InterBase years
Hmm.
and years and years ago. Well, actually, DB3, if you remember DB3, but
Oh, wow.
um, I did that was just kind of when I was exploring databases. But then, like, I did some work where I actually built a system, a production system that used InterBase early on, like Delphi 5, 6 era.
Hmm.
Then I went and did a lot of work on Oracle. And that's when I really learned databases and how to work with databases and understood, kind of the concepts and stuff around databases. And then there was a number of bottleneck or issues that you just had that you couldn't do with Oracle. And then now coming back and using InterBase again and learning more about InterBase, there's so many times I'm like, oh man, would love to have had this when we were working with Oracle. So I know that like MySQL and in Microsoft SQL Server are probably the two biggest databases around today, but there's still so many things that InterBase does so well that is from my experience and what I've seen is just such a improvement over all the other databases out there. So this is I always learn a lot from these and great stuff. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Anytime.
All right. Well, with that, we'll let everybody go and we'll catch you all next time. Take care, everybody.